In the stillness of a cold April night, a survivor would later whisper, "It didn't seem real, not until the lights went out." Those final flickering seconds became the line between life and death, between a world that believed in the unsinkable and the truth that waited beneath the surface. Tonight we revisit those last 2 hours, not as legend, not as Hollywood, but minute by minute, exactly as they unfolded. Because for the first time in history, new ultra-detailed digital scans from 2023 to 2025 have revealed evidence experts had never seen before: hidden damage along the hull, violent structural failures, and the small, almost invisible weaknesses that sealed Titanic's fate. This is the most complete reconstruction ever attempted, not just what people remembered, but what really happened. So take a breath. We begin at 11:40 p.m, the moment the iceberg brushed the starboard side and time itself seemed to fracture. What was Titanic? For years before she ever touched the Atlantic, Titanic lived in the world's imagination as something close to perfect. Newspapers called her practically unsinkable, an engineering triumph so vast and so advanced that nature itself seemed powerless against her. Harland and Wolff had built her with the confidence of a new century, a ship forged from steel and ambition. The world believed she was the safest vessel ever made. Inside, she was a floating palace. Grand staircases, gilded ceilings, Turkish baths, electric elevators, and dining rooms that resembled the finest hotels in London and Paris. First-class passengers walked her decks as though strolling through a city of luxury at sea, while immigrants in steerage carried dreams of new lives waiting in America. Every detail of her design spoke of optimism, comfort, and absolute faith in human progress. On April 10, 1912, Titanic left Southampton on her maiden voyage to New York. She carried more than 2,000 people, workers, families, millionaires, and children, each unaware that the journey ahead would make their names echo through history. Yet among all that grandeur and confidence, a quiet flaw traveled with them. The ship sailed with only 20 lifeboats. It was a number that fully complied with outdated maritime laws, but far short of what was needed for everyone on board. Titanic was strong, but not invincible. She was brilliant, but not perfect, and as she cut through the icy Atlantic, small oversights and bold assumptions waited beneath the surface, tiny decisions and fragile design limits that would soon collide with fate in a way no one on that shining deck could imagine. The night of April 14, 1912. On the night of April 14, 1912, the Atlantic felt unnaturally calm. The sea was so still that sailors later called it a flat calm, a rare state where waves seemed to vanish and the horizon blended softly into the dark. There was no moon, no glow to outline danger, only starlight scattered across an empty sky. Titanic pushed forward at nearly full speed, slicing cleanly through the cold water at more than 21 knots, confident and steady. Yet, across the ship's wireless room, a series of ice warnings had been arriving throughout the evening, some of them never reaching the bridge amid the rush of passenger messages pouring in. On the bridge, officers kept watch with routine ease. The air was sharp and biting, but nothing seemed unusual. The lookout platform remained their first line of defense, though without binoculars, a small but fateful detail that would later haunt investigators. In the engine room deep below, firemen fed coal into roaring furnaces, unaware that the cold waters ahead hid more than drifting ice. Their world was heat, sweat, and rhythm, the heartbeat of the ship itself. In first class, passengers lingered after dinner, enjoying music, conversation, and the soft hum of the engines beneath their feet. Some played cards late into the night. Others returned to staterooms that felt as safe as any luxury hotel on land. In second and third class, families settled children into bunks, sharing stories of the new lives waiting in America. Everything felt peaceful, predictable, and entirely ordinary. Yet outside that warm, sheltered world, the temperature had dropped sharply. The sea ahead was littered with reports of drifting ice, large bergs, and smaller, harder-to-spot growlers. Titanic's speed, the darkness, and the scattered warnings formed a quiet storm of risk that no one fully recognized. The danger was already there, silent, invisible, and waiting in the night. The collision. At 11:40 p.m., the night's silence was broken, not by a shout, but by a thin, urgent cry from the crow's nest. "Iceberg, right ahead!" The lookouts had seen a dark shape appear out of the black. There was no moon to give its silhouette away. On the bridge, First Officer Murdoch's voice cut through the calm, harder starboard, full astern. The great engines thundered in reverse, and stewards ran to slam watertight doors, but the ship's momentum and the iceberg's position turned the collision into a grazing, catastrophic kiss along the starboard side. Contemporary timelines record those orders and the initial panic that followed. From above, in the first-class lounge, the impact was a surreal, distant shock, a vibration underfoot, a muffled groan like distant thunder. Crystal tinkled in drawing rooms as people exchanged puzzled looks, and then, against that smooth veneer, hurried to peer out and assess. Many in luxury simply assumed the engines or hull noises were part of the ship's machinery settling. No one at once comprehended the invisible wound spreading below. Deep below, the boiler rooms told a different story. Firemen and stokers felt a sudden change. The heat of the furnaces, the regular rhythm of shoveling coal, the steady glow of the boiler plates, all interrupted by the cold intrusion of seawater. Men below decks were the first to notice water where it shouldn't be, the first to smell the cold and iron of the ocean where only heat should reach. They moved to close valves and report up the ladder, unaware that the ship's fate was being decided at the seams. In third class, corridors and narrow passageways filled with the confusion of families waking to muffled commotion. Doors were unlocked, voices rose, and people stumbled into corridors that were still, for the moment, dry. The social separation of decks meant different worlds reacted at different paces, and in those first violent minutes, the human patterns of the ship, who saw what, who heard what first began to matter. Modern scans revealed the truth hidden beneath early eyewitness sketches. The iceberg did not carve one large gash, but instead produced a series of thin punctures and stretched seam failures across multiple plates. The 2023-2025 digital twin shows long, narrow breaches spread over 6 of the hull's watertight compartments. Each puncture alone seemed insignificant, but together they breached the ship's design tolerance of 4 flooded compartments. Advanced reconstructions map the step-by-step flooding as water crept from one compartment to the next, each seam failure and rivet pull adding minutes that would determine survival or doom. The first 20 minutes. For the first several minutes after impact, confusion ruled the decks far more than fear. Officers exchanged quick assessments, but even they struggled to grasp the scale of the damage. Titanic felt steady, the engines had stopped cleanly, and there was no dramatic tearing or catastrophic jolt. To most people on board, it seemed as though nothing truly dangerous had happened. Early officer reports reflected this uncertainty. Several believed the ship could remain afloat long enough for help to arrive, a misjudgment fueled in part by absolute confidence in her design. Passengers, lulled by Titanic's reputation as virtually unsinkable, stayed calm. Many returned to their cabins, some joked lightly about a possible delay, and others asked stewards if they should bother dressing warmly. The idea that the largest and safest ship ever built could be in mortal danger simply didn't fit into anyone's imagination. Testimonies later described this early period as strangely quiet, almost polite in its confusion. Below, engineers rushed through the lower compartments, wading into rising seawater to inspect damage firsthand. Their lanterns flickered across cold steel plates bowing inward, rivets popped out like broken bones, and water surged in faster than any pump could fight. They climbed back to report the unthinkable. 6 watertight compartments were already flooding. In those narrow corridors beneath the passenger decks, they understood the truth before anyone else. Captain Smith moved quickly between officers, architects and engineers, trying to piece together the reality. Within minutes he reached the chilling conclusion. Titanic had been built to remain afloat with 4 compartments flooded, not 6. The mathematics of survival had already failed. He ordered distress rockets prepared and told the wireless room to send CQD, followed soon after by SOS, among the earliest recorded uses of the newer signal. In the wireless room, operators Jack Phillips and Harold Bride tapped out urgent calls into the night, unaware that the next 2 hours would define their place in history. On deck, the calm still held, but beneath it, a fatal truth had already taken root. Titanic was sinking. The evacuation begins. By 12:05 a.m., the order no one wanted to give finally came: prepare the lifeboats. Even then, officers hesitated, still unsure how quickly the ship was failing. Titanic looked steady, her decks level enough that many passengers doubted there was any real danger. When crew began uncovering the boats, several first-class passengers asked if it was merely a precaution, irritated at being pulled into the cold night. Others simply refused to step inside the wooden craft, insisting they'd rather stay aboard the great liner than sit in a small boat suspended over the dark Atlantic. The lifeboat problem soon became unavoidable. Titanic carried only 20 boats with total space for about 1,178 people, far short of the more than 2,200 on board. The number met maritime laws of the era, but ignored the reality of a fully loaded ship. Officers tried to explain the situation, but it was a hard truth to grasp. The world's safest ship simply didn't have enough room for everyone if things went wrong. The first lifeboats lowered from the starboard side were nearly empty. Boat number 7 left the ship with around 28 people, despite a capacity of over 60. Similar scenes played out along the deck as officers pleaded with passengers to step in. Many still believed Titanic would remain afloat until rescue arrived, and stepping from warm, electric-lit decks into a small, open boat felt like a foolish overreaction. Up in first class, confusion reigned. Families tried to stay together despite the women and children first order, and some men stepped back voluntarily, while others argued. Stewards moved between staterooms, urging passengers to dress warmly and come topside. The atmosphere shifted from curiosity to unease as more people realized the seriousness of the situation. In third class, chaos took a harsher form. Many passengers found certain gates and corridors locked or blocked, a result of immigration regulations requiring separation of classes during voyages. Crowds gathered in narrow hallways, some trying to find alternate routes to the boat deck, others desperately seeking crew members to guide them. Their confusion and delay cost precious minutes. Crew members themselves were under immense strain. Few had been trained for a full-scale evacuation, and communication across decks was inconsistent. Orders changed rapidly, and the darkness, rising cold, and unfamiliar procedures heightened the pressure on everyone involved. Amid this growing urgency, the ship's internal condition worsened. Modern digital scans created between 2023 and 2025 reveal the hull's subtle shift in angle during these early minutes, showing how water spread progressively through compartments, lifting the bow and creating a deceptively gentle but dangerous forward tilt. These models confirm that while the ship still appeared stable from above, her internal structure was already losing the battle. By 12:45 a.m., the last doubts began to fade. The first rockets launched into the sky, white bursts signaling distress, while the half-empty lifeboats drifted into the darkness. The evacuation had begun, but the clock was already turning against them. Engineers and firemen. In the bowels of the ship, far from the panic building on deck, Titanic's engineering crew fought a silent, desperate battle. When the iceberg struck, seawater rushed into the lower compartments with a force no one topside could truly imagine. Engineers and firemen stood ankle-deep, then knee-deep, in freezing black water as they worked to keep the ship alive for as long as human hands could manage. They opened valves, redirected steam, and kept the great pumps pounding against the rising flood. Every minute they held back, the sea meant more time for lifeboats to load and more chances for passengers to escape. Amid the chaos, their primary mission became preserving electricity. The lights that stayed bright on deck, the wireless signals that continued to go out, the power that allowed distress rockets to fire and lifeboat winches to work, all of it depended on the men below. They knew the danger more clearly than anyone. They felt the ship groaning under them, watched bulkheads bulge inward, and heard the roar of water tearing through steel. But still they stayed, fully aware they would not reach a lifeboat. Recent digital examinations of the wreck, completed between 2023 and 2025, have revealed physical proof of their final efforts. Scans show open steam valves frozen in place, evidence that the engineers continued working until the ship's last moments. Several boilers were found with concave surfaces, bowed inward as pressure dropped violently during the sinking, a sign that steam was still being managed, even as the stern began to rise. These details align with survivor accounts that the lights burned until the final plunge, flickering only at the very end. Their sacrifice bought nearly an hour of additional survival time. Without the engineers and firemen holding their ground, the lifeboats would have launched in darkness, confusion would have doubled, and hundreds who lived would never have escaped. Their story remains one of the most profound acts of duty ever recorded at sea. Panic rises. By 12:45 a.m., the calm veneer that had defined the early evacuation finally shattered. Titanic's bow had dipped low enough that the increasing list to starboard became impossible to ignore. Passengers felt it beneath their feet, a slow but undeniable tilt, a sensation that the deck was no longer level. What had seemed like caution only minutes earlier now felt like a real threat. More people poured onto the boat deck, and the truth spread through murmurs, gasps, and rising panic. The unthinkable was happening. As the angle grew sharper, old-class barriers began to dissolve. First-class passengers who had lingered now stood beside families from second class who had fought their way up, and behind them, groups of third-class passengers finally arriving after navigating locked gates and confusion below. Voices overlapped, instructions clashed, and the rigid social order of Titanic began to buckle under the same pressure that was tearing through her hull. Amid the rising tension, the ship's orchestra quietly took their places near the entrance to the grand staircase, their music offering a strange sense of steadiness as fear took hold. Survivors later recalled that the notes drifted through the cold air, soft and reassuring, giving passengers something familiar to cling to as the situation darkened around them. In the wireless room, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride were still tapping relentlessly at their keys. Their signals finally reached RMS Carpathia, more than 50 miles away. Captain Rostron of the Carpathia immediately ordered his ship to turn and steam at full speed through dangerous ice fields to reach Titanic. The knowledge that help was coming brought a flicker of hope, but it was quickly overshadowed by the worsening scene above. On the boat deck, chaos took hold. As officers tried to enforce the women and children first rule, crowds surged toward the remaining lifeboats. More than once, boats threatened to tip as too many people leaned toward them at once. Some families were torn apart when fathers were ordered back, forced to watch wives and children lifted away into the darkness. Arguments erupted, pleas filled the air, and officers fired warning shots to maintain control. Worse still, the ship's tilt made each launch harder than the last. Ropes strained, boats scraped against the hull, and time ran short. With every minute that passed, the panic grew, fueled by a single truth that could no longer be denied. Titanic was dying, and the window to escape her was closing fast. The final hour. By 1:30 a.m., the bow had dipped far enough that water began spilling over the grand staircase dome, cascading into the opulent first-class spaces below. The ornate ceilings, once symbols of luxury and human ambition, now trembled under the weight of the sea. Passengers felt a cold, creeping dread as lights flickered across the decks, electricity struggling to hold against the rising water. Crew members shouted orders over the roar, but their voices were swallowed by the growing chaos and the deafening sound of steel bending. The stern of the ship rose slowly at first, then with alarming speed, tilting skyward as if reaching for the stars, while the bow plunged deeper. Eyewitnesses later described a surreal, almost cinematic scene. The massive hull twisted against itself, decks angling sharply, railings at impossible slopes, and people scrambling desperately to cling to whatever surface they could. The final lifeboats were launched from the remaining accessible deck, rocking violently as they pulled away into the icy Atlantic. Families gripped each other tightly, some clutching children who screamed, others praying silently as the great ship continued its final dance with gravity and the ocean. Digital scans conducted between 2023 and 2025 reveal that Titanic did not break gently as previously imagined. The wreck shows evidence of a violent breakup, with structural stresses tearing the stern into a mangled heap. Plates buckled and rivets tore apart as the aft section was lifted skyward, a sudden release of energy that would have thrown anyone nearby into the freezing water. These scans confirm eyewitness reports of the ship twisting, groaning, and snapping in ways that make earlier depictions of a slow, elegant split misleading. Captain Edward Smith remained on the bridge, a figure of grim resolve amidst the pandemonium. Witnesses last saw him standing quietly, issuing calm directions to officers and signaling final instructions for lifeboat launches. He never attempted to save himself, understanding that his duty was to ensure the maximum possible evacuation of passengers. His decision exemplified leadership under impossible circumstances, a human anchor in a sea of fear. As the clock approached 2:20 a.m., Titanic's final moments played out with tragic inevitability. The stern towered above the water, then, under the tremendous forces at play, the hull split and plunged. The last cries, the last desperate clutches for safety, were swallowed by the icy Atlantic. The great ship, once the pride of human engineering, had met the limit of its design, its final hour, a testament to both human courage and the overwhelming power of nature. Critical moment. At 2:18 a.m., the tension that had been building for nearly 3 hours reached its terrifying climax. The bow, already buried deep in the freezing Atlantic, began to pull the stern downward with irresistible force. Water poured into every opening as the ship's own weight and the pressure of the ocean created a deadly downward drag. On the deck, those still clinging to rails and spars were thrown violently into the icy water as the vessel's metal frame groaned and twisted. Between the massive funnels, the ship snapped. The steel hull, once a symbol of unshakable engineering, fractured under the stress. Survivors described seeing a gap open like the maw of a giant, swallowing sections of the decks in seconds. The violent separation sent a shockwave of water over the remaining lifeboats, pitching some dangerously and causing others to drift away from the ship entirely. Families that had been torn apart earlier now faced the final, merciless reality of the ocean. Digital scans from 2023 to 2025 provide new insight into this final breakup. The stern did not sink gently, but twisted almost impossibly as it descended. Its deck plates warped, railings contorted, and bulkheads bent inward. The wreck's shape confirms eyewitness accounts of the violent spiral, showing how structural stresses caused the stern to buckle and collapse in on itself while the bow dragged it downward. The visual evidence aligns chillingly with survivor descriptions of sudden, sharp movements that flung people into the water. As the final seconds passed, the lights, maintained by the heroic engineers for so long, began to flicker and die. Darkness fell instantly over the deck. The final link between human life and the vessel extinguished. Water surged over every remaining surface, swallowing the last glimpses of the ship as it completed its descent. At 2:20 a.m., Titanic took its final plunge. The once mighty liner, a symbol of human ambition and pride, was gone beneath the Atlantic, leaving behind only a trail of tragedy, heroism, and memory. Aftermath in the water. As Titanic vanished beneath the icy Atlantic, more than 1,500 people were left fighting for their lives in water that could steal consciousness in minutes. The cold was relentless. Survivors later described muscles seizing, breaths catching, and shock overtaking even the strongest swimmers. Screams pierced the night at first, echoing across the dark expanse, but as minutes passed, the chaos gave way to a chilling silence, broken only by occasional cries and the slapping of waves against debris. Lifeboats that had been launched earlier now drifted at a distance, hesitant to return. Fear of being swamped by desperate swimmers and the impossibility of maneuvering in darkness held them back. Only one, commanded by a courageous officer, ventured close enough to pick up survivors, its small crew risking capsizing in order to save lives. Most boats remained anchored, waiting until daylight, leaving the majority of people struggling alone in the freezing water. The eerie stillness that followed the initial screams was almost surreal. The ocean, vast and unyielding, seemed to swallow every sound. Floating wreckage and personal belongings drifted across the waves, reminders of the human stories now at stake. Some survivors later recounted the sensation of being suspended between life and death, grasping fragments of wood or the bodies of strangers to stay afloat. Every second was a battle against cold, fatigue, and despair. Perspectives from those who endured that night reveal a mix of horror, confusion, and fleeting moments of compassion. A man recalled holding a child tightly against him, singing softly to calm both of them as waves threatened to pull them under. Women clung to floating debris, praying silently while watching others disappear. These accounts give voice to the human struggle in the face of overwhelming tragedy, capturing a side of Titanic's disaster that numbers alone cannot convey. In the darkness, the survivors' endurance became a testament to human resilience. Some would be rescued hours later, their lives saved in large part by the efforts of those heroic lifeboat crews and the impending arrival of RMS Carpathia. But the image of the Atlantic that night, still, cold, and vast, remained forever etched into memory, a haunting reminder of the thin line between life and death. Rescue by Carpathia. At dawn, the first signs of hope appeared on the horizon. RMS Carpathia, steaming through icy waters at full speed, spotted the scattered lifeboats like tiny islands in the vast Atlantic. Survivors, pale and shivering, raised weak arms in greeting as the ship approached. The sight of human faces, alive and waiting, brought a fragile relief after the horrors of the night. Carpathia's crew immediately sprang into action. Boats were carefully pulled alongside, ropes thrown, and survivors lifted aboard. Blankets, hot drinks, and medical attention were provided to those who could barely stand. Despite exhaustion and the bitter cold, the officers and sailors worked tirelessly, forming human chains and holding onto the most fragile passengers as they climbed to safety. The exact number rescued remained a matter of debate. Ship manifests were incomplete, and some passengers had boarded under aliases. Estimates ranged from 700 to 710 survivors, while the death toll exceeded 1,500. Even in the midst of celebration and relief, the enormity of the loss was impossible to ignore. Inside Carpathia, the wireless operators finally collapsed in exhaustion. Jack Phillips and Harold Bride had spent hours sending distress signals, maintaining communication, and coordinating with Titanic before the transmission line went silent. Their work had been vital, and yet by the time rescue was complete, they were drained, trembling, and nearly unable to walk. Their endurance had saved lives, and now they could finally rest. As the lifeboats emptied and the surviving passengers were brought aboard, a sense of tentative healing began. Dawn broke over a quiet ocean, its calm belying the tragedy that had unfolded, offering a moment of fragile closure to those who had lived through the night. What we know now. Thanks to cutting-edge technology, the story of Titanic has been revisited with unprecedented clarity. Between 2023 and 2025, researchers created a digital twin of the wreck, an ultra-detailed 3D model that captures every rivet, seam, and structural bend. This technology allowed scientists to examine the ship's final hours in ways that were previously impossible, revealing how minor punctures and seam failures combined to flood 6 compartments and doom the vessel. These scans confirmed that the breakup was far more violent than early depictions suggested. The stern twisted and collapsed under the weight of the ship and the pressure of the ocean, rather than splitting gently as popular culture had long portrayed. Structural stresses, rivets pulling free, and buckled hull plates all contributed to a sudden, explosive disintegration that eyewitnesses described, but early investigators could not fully explain. The new data reshapes our understanding of Titanic, not as a simple failure or a legend, but as a complex interplay of human decision-making, design limitations, and sheer misfortune. Small holes, heroic actions, and misjudgments combined to produce catastrophe. The digital twin allows us to separate myth from reality, showing that while the ship's grandeur and unsinkable reputation captured the world's imagination, the true story is both more precise and more tragic than ever imagined. Legacy. Titanic's story is more than a tale of steel and ice. It is a lesson in humility, foresight, and the limits of human engineering. The word unsinkable, once a symbol of pride, now serves as a reminder that no creation, however grand, is invulnerable to nature, error, or circumstance. Her sinking exposed flaws in safety regulations, in human judgment, and in assumptions that would have consequences far beyond a single night. Yet, amid tragedy, heroism shone. Engineers and firemen stayed at their posts, wireless operators tapped out life-saving messages, and countless passengers showed courage, selflessness, or fierce determination to protect others. Their actions remain a testament to human resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. As the Atlantic claimed Titanic, the world learned the price of hubris and the value of vigilance, compassion, and courage. Though she rests on the ocean floor, her story continues to teach, haunt, and inspire, a sobering echo of humanity's reach and its limits.